On July 5, 1943 at 0430 hours, German artillery opened fire across the Kursk salient. Operation Citadel, the largest German offensive on the Eastern Front since 1941, had begun. Panzer divisions of Army Group South advanced north from Belgorod. Nearly 800 tanks, including the new Tiger and Panther models, moved forward in coordinated formations. Intelligence briefings had outlined Soviet defensive positions. Reconnaissance had identified forward trenches, anti-tank positions, and minefields. German forces knew Soviet defenses at Kursk were substantial. What they underestimated was depth. German planning assumed defensive positions extending several kilometers. They judged them strong but penetrable through a concentrated assault. Breakthrough was calculated within 3 to 5 days. Within the first hours, lead Panzer elements encountered the expected resistance. Soviet anti-tank guns opened fire from prepared positions. Infantry engaged from forward trenches. Minefields channeled advancing armor into kill zones. This matched intelligence predictions. German forces had fought through Soviet defenses before. The pattern was familiar: heavy initial resistance, gradual attrition, and eventual breakthrough. But the resistance didn't diminish. German units advanced through the first defensive belt, then encountered a second. They fought through the second and found a third, then a fourth. Each belt contained fresh troops, prepared positions, extensive minefields, and concentrated anti-tank guns. By the end of July 5th, German forces that had expected to advance 30 kilometers had gained less than 10 kilometers. Some divisions measured progress in hundreds of meters. German reconnaissance had assessed the defensive DE path as limited, but it extended beyond 30 kilometers of fortified positions in the main attack sectors. This was not improvisation. The Soviets had spent 6 weeks constructing one of the most extensive defensive systems ever built. German aerial observation flew daily sorties. Intelligence officers analyzed every photograph. Reconnaissance identified strong defensive positions. What they failed to grasp was the true depth and density of what lay beyond the forward belts visible in aerial imagery. Standard German reconnaissance in 1943 was comprehensive. Luftwaffe aerial observation units photographed Soviet positions regularly. Photo interpretation specialists analyzed images for defensive construction. Ground observers tracked visible Soviet activity. Radio intercepts monitored communications. The system had successfully identified defensive preparations throughout 1941 and 1942. German intelligence identified extensive fortification work at Kursk. Reports noted Soviet forces constructing defensive positions across the salient. Reconnaissance photographs showed trench networks, anti-tank positions, and obstacle systems. Intelligence officers understood Soviet forces were preparing substantial defenses. The assessments before Operation Citadel acknowledged this reality. What intelligence underestimated was the systematic depth of construction beyond what aerial photography could definitively assess. Soviet defensive planning for Kursk began in April 1943 after intelligence indicated German preparations for a summer offensive. Marshal Zhukov and the Stavka decided to prepare defense in depth that would bleed German armored forces through attrition before launching counteroffensive operations. The Kursk defensive system would implement doctrine at an unprecedented scale. Not just 2 or 3 defensive belts, but multiple fortified zones reaching depths exceeding 30 kilometers in key sectors. Construction began in late April 1943, approximately 6 weeks before the German offensive. Soviet engineering units received detailed plans specifying trench networks, weapon positions, and obstacle placement. Infantry divisions contributed troops for excavation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers participated. Millions of cubic meters of earth were excavated. Thousands of weapon positions were prepared. Soviet procedures treated camouflage as integral to defensive preparation. Forward defensive positions were constructed to be visible. German reconnaissance was meant to see them. These positions confirmed Soviet defensive deployment and provided intelligence with identifiable signatures that matched expected patterns. Rear defensive belts received different treatment. positions followed natural terrain features. Trenches used ravines, tree lines, and areas where linear features blended with the existing landscape. Excavated earth was dispersed rather than piled beside positions. Construction was scheduled for periods of limited visibility. The depth defeated accurate assessment. German aerial observation identified forward defensive positions because they were meant to be identified. Reconnaissance examining sectors behind forward positions saw terrain consistent with limited rear area fortifications. This was systematic construction designed around reconnaissance limitations. Forward belts were obvious. Rear belts were constructed in ways that minimized aerial signatures. Anti-tank guns represented the primary killing mechanism. Soviet forces concentrated anti-tank weapons in densities exceeding German intelligence estimates. Thousands of anti-tank guns were arranged in depth so that German armor penetrating the first belt immediately encountered the second. Guns positioned in rear belts could engage German forces before they cleared forward positions, creating overlapping fire zones German planning had not anticipated. Concealed anti-tank positions were sophisticated. Guns were sited in ravines, forest edges, and depressions that provided overhead cover. Firing positions were prepared with minimal profile. Guns remained concealed until German armor entered engagement range. Then they fired from positions that German reconnaissance had assessed as containing limited deployments. Minefields complemented the anti-tank guns by channeling German armor into kill zones. Soviet engineers laid mines in densities exceeding previous operations. The mines were concentrated in specific areas designed to force German tanks into predictable paths where anti-tank guns waited. Artillery positions in rear belts provided supporting fire that German counter-battery efforts could not suppress, because the depth exceeded initial range assumptions. German intelligence collection continued throughout May and June as construction progressed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the Kursk salient systematically, and intelligence officers identified forward defensive positions, treating them as evidence of a strong Soviet defensive deployment. Reports noted extensive fortification work, but what the photographs and analysis did not reveal was the full depth of construction in sectors beyond those forward positions. The possibility that multiple additional fortified belts existed in depth was not considered, because visible signatures did not suggest construction at that scale. The assessment process was methodical. Intelligence officers analyzed available information and reached conclusions supported by that information. Forward positions were visible and assessed as strong. Rear areas showed signatures consistent with limited supporting fortifications. The conclusion that Soviet defensive depth, while substantial, was penetrable through concentrated armored assault reflected systematic analysis and confidence based on previous German success breaking through Soviet positions. On July 5th at 0530 hours, Panzer divisions advanced. Leading elements encountered forward Soviet positions and engaged as intelligence had predicted. Strong resistance, but manageable. The first defensive belt offered substantial resistance, but German forces had experience fighting through Soviet defenses. Then the depth revealed itself. German forces that had fought through the first belt, expecting diminishing resistance, encountered a second belt of equivalent strength. The pattern repeated. The third belt, the fourth belt. Each contained prepared positions, concentrated anti-tank guns, extensive minefields. German commanders receiving reports from advancing units confronted operational reality fundamentally different from planning assumptions. The defensive depth extended beyond 30 kilometers of fortified positions. Anti-tank gun density was concentrated at levels that made rapid advance impossible. Panzer units reported encountering sustained anti-tank fire from multiple defensive belts. The advance rates collapsed. Divisions expected to gain 30 kilometers on July 5th measured progress in single-digit kilometers. Some units advanced less than a kilometer. Every meter gained required fighting through prepared defenses. German armor losses mounted. Infantry casualties increased as troops assaulted defensive belts that proved as strong as the first positions encountered hours earlier. By July 12th, 1 week after the offensive began, Operation Citadel had failed to achieve its objectives. German forces had penetrated Soviet defenses, but had not accomplished breakthrough. The defensive depth had absorbed the German offensive. Panzer divisions that began the operation with nearly 800 tanks had lost several hundred vehicles fighting through defensive belts whose full extent intelligence had not predicted. After the offensive, German analysis tried to explain why assessments of defensive depth were so inaccurate. Officers examined reconnaissance photographs taken before July 5, 1943. The photographs showed forward positions clearly. Rear areas appeared to contain supporting fortifications consistent with Soviet defensive doctrine. Yet ground forces encountered extensive defensive systems that continued far beyond what aerial assessment had predicted. Intelligence failure was not technological or procedural. German reconnaissance capabilities were substantial and were applied systematically. The failure was analytical. Intelligence underestimated the depth and density of Soviet defensive construction based on what was clearly observable in reconnaissance imagery. The assumption that rear areas contained limited supporting fortifications proved incorrect when Soviet forces had systematically constructed multiple defensive belts designed to be difficult to identify definitively from the air. The psychological dimension was significant. German commanders in the summer of 1943 had substantial experience penetrating Soviet defenses. Throughout 1941 and 1942, German offensives had broken through Soviet defensive lines. Intelligence assessments indicating substantial but manageable defensive depth at Kursk aligned with command expectations based on previous operational success. This created analytical vulnerability. The expectation that rear areas contained supporting positions rather than additional complete defensive belts seemed reasonable based on previous experience. Soviet success validated defensive doctrine that emphasized systematic depth. Building multiple defensive belts required massive resources and coordination. Maintaining construction discipline across hundreds of thousands of troops required systematic procedures. The defensive investment prevented German offensive success and created conditions for subsequent Soviet counteroffensives that shifted strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. On July 5, 1943, German intelligence assessed Soviet defensive positions at Kursk as substantial but penetrable through concentrated armored assault. Forward defensive positions were identified, assessed as strong, and incorporated into operational planning. Rear areas appeared to contain supporting fortifications consistent with Soviet defensive doctrine observed in previous operations. German Panzer divisions advancing on July 5 encountered defensive depth that exceeded planning assumptions by substantial margins. There were multiple fortified belts extending beyond 30 kilometers. There were concentrated anti-tank weapons at densities intelligence had not predicted. The defensive system, which intelligence had partially observed but systematically underestimated, cost German armored forces several hundred tanks and forced termination of the offensive within days. The challenge was not that Soviet defenses were invisible to German reconnaissance. Reconnaissance identified substantial fortifications. Intelligence knew Soviet forces were preparing strong defensive positions. What they underestimated was the depth and density of what Soviet forces had systematically constructed beyond what was definitively observable in aerial photographs. The Soviets had built defensive depth at an unprecedented scale. German reconnaissance had photographed the ground systematically. They identified strong forward positions and assessed them accurately. What lay beyond those forward positions, constructed with systematic attention to minimizing definitive aerial signatures, exceeded what intelligence analysis predicted. That was Kursk, the fortress whose full depth emerged only when German forces encountered it on the ground.